invitation to speak to all of you today. Happy New Year. I saw some familiar names here, and even though, I don't see you, in live at the moment, but just really happy to see everybody. I hope you have a good holiday. And I thought I would start by sharing, a little bit about myself, maybe even my personal journey in the last few years, and give you some ideas to why I become interested in wellness. Several years ago, I once thought that I lived a very fulfilling life. I try to provide the best care to my patients through clinical work at sick kids. And also, being a scientist, I also try to generate new knowledge through my research. As well, being an academic center, I'm able to nurture new generations of doctors, as well as it's very actually distracting. I'm trying to admit people while at the same time I'm talking. So just pardon me if you notice that I'm kind of a little bit choppy here. So I'm just talking about, what have been my roles been. I've been involved in also teaching doctors as well as graduate students through research and teachings, as well as serving the hospital, university, and the larger healthcare system through various leadership positions. I felt that I was truly blessed because I would not have been able to accomplish all these without a loving family. And many would say that I have reached the pinnacle of success, while at the same time achieve a very fine work-life balance. But these accomplishments were not enough. I continued to climb the ladder by pursuing an MBA a few years ago. Then suddenly, something completely unexpected happened. I developed a hearing loss in 1 year. The worst part of it was a constant 24/7 nonstop ringing in my ear. I could not rest. I could not sleep. I could not have a moment of peace and quiet. I was treated with steroid injections into my ear. I was put on oral steroids. Not only did they not help, I developed suicidal thoughts as a side effect, which frightened me to the core. When all Western treatment options were exhausted, my doctor covertly told me that he did not want to see me anymore. I felt abandoned, desperate, and hopeless inside. But on the outside, I continued to put on a brave face and carry out all my clinical duties, pretending that I could endure all of these challenges with my usual determination and perseverance. As I suffered deeply inside, I began to see clearly all the sufferings around me. I realized that despite many successes, our satisfaction seems to be short-lived. At times, we become unhappy because we don't get what we want, or we get what we don't want, or we worry about things not going our way. As I looked around, I felt deeply the stress that my colleagues experience every day from their workload, the agony we face when we have to make complex and difficult decisions, and ultimately, the suffering that we all have to confront: sickness, old age, and death. I began to realize that our well-being does not come from the 3 A's. I call it the 3 A's: achieving, acquiring, and accumulating. At a certain point in time, the pursuit of material possessions, pleasures, praises, and recognitions makes life feel hollow. Without awareness and the courage to look deeply or make changes, we may work harder and accumulate more, only to find that the happiness and deep fulfillment that we long for remain elusive. After a very long period of reflection, what I call the dark night of my soul, I decided to do the unthinkable. I stepped down from all my leadership positions before completing my terms. I closed my lab. I turned part-time. However, my heart was torn. I kept thinking, what will people think of me? Will I ever be trusted again? Am I setting the bad example for my kids by being a quitter? I've never quit anything before. Am I wasting my many years of training to be an expert? Confronting these questions were painful and frightening. Going through these changes felt like a career suicide, a mini death. Because unbeknown to me, my identity, my self-worth, and sense of purpose have been completely wrapped up with my titles, roles, and external validation. But I asked myself, who am I really, and what should I do next? I began by looking at what I enjoyed most. I realized what has brought me the most joy was meeting people, listening to them, and serving them in whatever way I could. I also recognized that I have been increasingly drawn to the spiritual needs of the dying and the families, having witnessed the death of my beloved father and mother-in-law several years ago. At the same time, because I've been practicing mindfulness for several years, I wanted to dive deeper into its Eastern roots. Because of these, I decided to pursue chaplaincy training. On looking back, chaplaincy training has been a deeply healing and transformative experience. It also brought me to many uncharted territories. Working as a volunteer in a hospice, as well as in prison, have been a complete eye-opener to me. I began to realize that I have lived a very privileged and cocooned life and have been completely oblivious to the unspeakably painful life circumstances that many people are facing. In chaplaincy, I also needed to write a master level thesis. My mind kept coming back to the same questions. Why is the healthcare system plagued with so many problems? How can I bring what I've learned in chaplaincy to medicine? How can I contribute to my colleagues as I really care about them? And this led me to focus on wellness. And I'm very glad that I'm able to share some of my thoughts with you today. So now I will need to share my screen with you. So just 1 second. So we will go into, let's see, desktop 2. And then I will press this. Okay, that should work now. All right. So the title of my talk today is to look at some inner resources and also look at how system thinking can help us to flourish in the healthcare. So as I mentioned, over the last few years, I have looked deeply into what are the essential, just 1 second, I need to also change this here, right? Okay. Let me see if I can do it here. Okay. So as I mentioned, over the last several years, I've looked deeply into what are the essential elements to support our well-being. I want to draw on the wisdoms that contemplative traditions have to offer, and at the same time, looking at them through the lens of modern science. I discovered that all the research has been pointing to the idea that wellness is plastic, that well-being is a trainable skill. And this is based on 3 scientific underpinnings. The first underpinning is the discovery of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain changes in response to experience and in response to training. We now know that the adult brain also possesses a remarkable ability to grow and adapt. What's more, plasticity means that emotions such as happiness and kindness can be cultivated in much the same way that we learn through repetition, such as when we play golf or play the piano. In other words, when we nurture our minds in a healthy way, our brains actually change both structurally and functionally. Another important scientific discovery, which is related to plasticity, is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. Each of us comes into the world with a sequence of base pairs that forms our DNA. And for the most part, that sequence will not change over the course of our lives. However, gene expression and production of proteins can be modulated by influences that we encounter during our lifetime. Now, these can be external influences, such as receiving affection from loved ones versus being abused, or internal influences, such as being anxious or having mental peace. For example, groundbreaking research published in Nature Neuroscience has shown that how a mother behaves toward her babies, the extent to which she's nurturing and loving, can actually induce epigenetic changes in her babies that mediate the stress response. And many scientists have discovered that meditation also induces epigenetic changes in ways that help to promote both mental and physical health. The third theme may be less familiar to us, but it is a theme that has gained increasing scientific evidence. And that is that every human being is born with innate basic goodness. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that when we come into the world, we have a predisposition for prosocial behaviors. We have a propensity for caring, kindness, and compassion. As humans transition from a pre-social world into a world of social interactions, there is a co-evolution of our biology and culture, which leads to changes in our physiology, anatomy, and psychology to support the emergence of prosocial behaviors. For example, scientists discovered that the vagus nerve has a ventral branch and that the hormone oxytocin also functions as a neurotransmitter. And both the ventral vagus nerve and oxytocin have evolved to enhance kinship and maternal bonding. Now, I want to show you a video of a study published in Nature that shows this predisposition can be seen even in very young infants. So let me play the video.
In this study, parents bring their 6-month-olds into the lab. At the other side of a long table is a hill stage. A red circle guy with googly eyes tries to climb the hill. He sort of goes up the hill and then falls back down. He always fails at it. Then a blue square character, also with googly eyes, comes from the bottom of the hill and bumps him up to the top of the hill so that he's successful. On different trials, the climber tries again to get to the top of the hill, and then a yellow triangle character comes down from the top and bumps him to the bottom of the hill, so prevents him from getting his goal. Babies see this a number of times until they get nice and bored with it. So we stop and basically do a choice measure. Moms are asked to close their eyes. An experimenter who did not see which character was which brings over the two characters to the babies and just sees which character the baby touches first.
Which one do you want?
We found that, impressively actually, almost 100% of babies preferred the more positive character.
What do you want?
Okay.
So we can see that there's actually innate predisposition in humans for prosocial behaviors. However, unfortunately, as we grow, we learn to differentiate who is and is not deserving of our kindness with social conditioning. So now with these scientific underpinnings in place, we can now look at the, I think, 4 inner resources that I think are critical for our well-being. And the first is attention stability. What is attention stability? It is our ability to be aware, to stay focused, and to be mindful. And it also involves a capacity that neuroscientists and psychologists call meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is knowing what our minds are doing, knowing where our mind is. So for example, I would like to invite you to participate in an experiment with me right now. So maybe you can take your eyes off the screen for a moment, and maybe if that feels comfortable for you, you can even close your eyes or simply lowering your gaze. And in this experiment, I simply want you to kind of focus on your breath the next minute or so. Seeing how we can pay attention to our breath and what happens when we try to focus on our breath. So now we'd like to invite you to come back to the screen. And well, because, we're in this forum, I'm not able to ask you, what you're experiencing, but at least I can share my experiences that I can feel that my mind is pumping, my mind is wandering as to, what should I talk about next. So you can see that, probably many of you also notice that it is actually not easy to focus on the breath, even for a minute. Our minds tend to drift here and there to the past or into the future. And this is exactly what mindfulness and meta-awareness is about. Every time you notice that your mind has wandered, at that moment, when you recognize that your mind has been lost, that's a moment of meta-awareness. That's a moment of awakening when you can bring your mind back to the present moment. Now, the second resource that I think is very important for well-being is insight. And this is insight into the self. We all have a narrative or a story about ourselves. We all carry around this narrative, a set of beliefs and expectations of what we are or who we are. At the very extreme end of the spectrum, there are people who have very negative beliefs about themselves. For example, it might manifest as self-criticism. You may notice that you're often your own harshest critic and that there is an inner voice in the head that constantly judge, disparage, and berate what we do or what we think. So part of well-being is having a healthy relationship to this narrative about ourselves, being able to see the narrative for what it is, not so much about changing the content of the narrative, but rather changing our relationship to the narrative. The third inner resource is compassion. Compassion includes qualities like kindness, caring, and a wish for everyone to be happy and free from suffering. These qualities brings a sense of calmness, peace, and contentment. And especially in healthcare, not only do we strive to be compassionate toward our patients, we also need to be willing to receive compassion from others. It is not a sign of weakness. And most importantly, to be kind to ourselves, to look after our own well-being. And finally, the last inner resource for well-being is purpose. And purpose here is about having a sense of direction, finding meaning in our lives. Related to purpose is having a moral compass, our ability to uphold our values and maintain our integrity in face of difficult situations. And most importantly, how do we align our everyday activities toward this sense of purpose? So these are the 4 inner resources for well-being. And I would like to show you a few studies to give you the evidence of their scientific underpinnings as to why I think these 4 ingredients are essential. Now, first, with respect to attention stability, a study published in Nature is really a very cleverly designed study. And it recruited about 3,500 people from all over the world. At different points during the day, they received a text message from their phone, which asked them 3 questions. The first is, what are you doing right now? And they had to check off from a list of activities. And the second question is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you are doing, or is it focused on something else? And the third question is, how happy or unhappy you are right now? And what the scientists discovered is that people spend an average of 47% of the time not paying attention to what they're doing. And this is very significant. That means half of the time we're actually mind wandering, not focusing at the task at hand. And what is even more instructive is that when people reported that they weren't paying attention to what they were doing, they actually reported that they were significantly less happy. This finding is aptly summarized in the title of this paper. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So you might ask, where does our mind usually wander to and how does it happen? And this is where the second inner resource for well-being, or insight, comes in. Insight is very, very important for resilience. And one way to define resilience is the ability to recover from adversity and the ability to gain insight into our self-narrative. Now, scientists have discovered a brain network that is responsible for mind wandering and for the generation of self-narrative. This brain network is called the default mode network because it is activated when we are at rest, as if the brain defaults to this activity or setting when we are not engaged in a specific task and seem to be doing nothing. Now, this network is evolutionarily important because it allows us to plan for the future, review past events, as well as remembering pertinent life information. But it is also responsible for rumination and has been shown that mental rumination is correlated with negative emotions. In fact, if this network is left unchecked, it causes mental arrest. Many studies have shown a high correlation between mental unrest and the activity of this network with major depression, anxiety, and a whole host of other mental disorders. Now, so you might ask, where is this network located? I'm kind of a neuroscientist. I always like to show brain diagram. So this is where the default mode network is located. Essentially, it is in the middle or in the midline and consists of two major midline structures. The first is the posterior cingulate cortex, which we can call it a selfer, because what it does is to add a sense of self to emotionally relevant memory to form our narrative, our story. And the second structure is called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the evaluator, because it generates self-referential judgments and regulates our emotional responses. Now, these two structures in the default mode network are heavily connected to two other structures in the limbic system or the emotional brain. And they are the amygdala, or we call it emotor, because it's responsible for generating emotions such as fear and stress, as well as the hippocampus, which is the memorizer, generating long-term memory. Now, to illustrate how this default mode network works, let's use the pandemic as an example. So for example, we have heard from the news that almost 2 million people have died in the world from COVID, and that people over 50 years of age are at high risk of dying from COVID. And this generates a fear response from the amygdala. The hippocampus, being the memorizer, stores this fearful information in our memory. The posterior cingulate cortex, being the selfer, in turn, integrates this fearful information with a sense of self to form a narrative or a story that is relevant to me through the lens of myself. So for example, for me, I might say, wow, I'm 52 years old. I'm an age group that is at highest risk for dying from COVID. The medial prefrontal cortex, the evaluator, that adds meaning to this fearful information. For example, I could interpret this information as important to take precaution, which is helpful and adaptive. So for example, I might remind myself that I need to wash my hands frequently, practicing social distancing, and wear a mask when I go out. Alternatively, because of negativity bias, the evaluator generates a series of unpleasant thoughts. So for example, I might start by thinking I could be infected by COVID. And then the next thought will be, it will be horrible to be not able to breathe, to be put on a ventilator and die alone. And then the next thought will be, oh, what will happen to my family if I die? Now you can see that these negative thoughts and imagination in turn can re-trigger the amygdala and keep the default mode network spinning via a vicious cycle, even though I actually don't have the virus. So you can see that the default mode network can be useful in helping us to learn from our experience, but it can also cause further stress if it is left unchecked. So how can we stop this network from spinning? Thankfully, there is another brain network called the attention network that can deactivate the default mode network. This attention network includes the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which directs our attention to what we want to attend to, as well as the anterior cingulate cortex, which detects when our mind wanders off and makes us aware of our distraction. So you might ask, what is the evidence that meditation enhances attention, balance, and insight, the first and second inner resources for well-being? A quick PubMed search using the key term mindfulness reveals that there has been an exponential increase in research in this area, so which is really, really exciting. And research has shown that attention, balance, and insight are actually trainable skills. For example, with training, there is an increased activity in the attention network, leading to more attention stability. There is also a decrease in activity in the amygdala, which leads to better emotion regulation. In addition, there's more connectivity between the attention network and the default mode network, which deactivates the default mode network and leads to less mind wandering. Now, these changes have also been shown to reduce stress level. For example, one of the stress responses in our body is the release of cytokines into the bloodstream from a variety of cells. These cytokines are responsible for inflammation in the body and have been linked to increased cardiovascular diseases. They serve as a stress biomarker, which we can measure by taking blood sample. In a study that looked at the effect of 3-day mindfulness training versus relaxation, it found that meditators had decreased circulating cytokines in the bloodstream even 4 months after training, which was not observed in people who had relaxation training. And I think this study is particularly important because many times we think that mindfulness or meditation is just a relaxation technique. But what we've shown here is that the release in the stress, the decrease in stress is not found in relaxation training. It's only found in meditation or mindfulness training. So you can see that there's actually a different effect on our bodily system through mindfulness meditation. Now we move on to the third inner resource that we talk about, which is compassion. Research have shown that compassion is actually also a trainable skill, and that it activates a brain network that is responsible for positive emotions such as joy, love, and peace. And this compassion network, shown in purple here, is responsible for 3 things. One is responsible for reward processing, pleasure, and positive emotion, and is mediated by the dopaminergic system. And it is also responsible for making pro-social connections, such as maternal bonding and romantic love, mediating through the neurotransmitter oxytocin. And it is also responsible for upregulating a positive emotion. Now, interestingly, this is in contradistinction to empathy. Empathy means that we put ourselves into the shoes of somebody else rather than wishing somebody else to be free from suffering. And neuroimaging has shown that when we empathize with someone's suffering, when we put ourselves into somebody's shoes, it activates another network called the empathy network, shown in pink here, which is responsible for generating negative emotions such as sadness, pain, and anxiety. And perhaps why in healthcare, when we see a patient suffering, when we empathize, we are taught to be strong, to stay professional, to detach ourselves so that we won't let our emotions affect our clinical judgment. Now, while there is nothing wrong to protect ourselves so that we can best serve others, the long-term consequence of suppressing or bottling up our emotions is that we may begin to feel numb, to become indifferent, to feel a lack of agency, which is a major cause of burnout. The good news is that if we can stay present with others' suffering, train ourselves to see that this is the suffering of others and not ours, we can transform empathy into compassion by wishing others to be well and free from suffering. And neuroscience has shown us that the motivation to alleviate others' suffering alone, even in situations when we actually cannot fix their problems or cure their disease, it can still lead to activation of the compassion network, which can bring us a sense of calm, ease, and peace. And not only that, randomized controlled trials have shown that if we spend as little as 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks to cultivate kindness and compassion, it is sufficient to produce significant changes in the brain and bring us a sense of well-being. So it doesn't really take much to begin to change these brain circuits and to increase our resilience in meaningful ways. Now, with regard to purpose, the fourth inner resource for well-being, it turns out that having a strong sense of purpose, a strong sense of meaning in our lives, is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity. And a number of very carefully controlled studies where pre-existing medical conditions are carefully controlled for have shown that people who are in the top percentiles in having a strong sense of purpose are also the one who lives longer. And this is also where epigenetics that I've talked about, the scientific opinion comes in earlier. Now, in each of us, there is a biological clock of aging in every cell in our body. At the ends of each chromosome are telomeres, and they are like the plastic tips at the end of a shoelace. They act as an end cap to protect our DNA. However, they become shorter and shorter with each cell division and with aging. Thankfully, there's an enzyme in our body called telomerase that actually slows this age-related shortening of telomeres. In fact, the more the telomerase in our body, the better for health and longevity. And studies have shown that for meditators, they actually were found to have more longer telomeres, as well as increased telomerase activity and telomere-related gene expression. And so having a strong sense of purpose is not just a subjective quality, but could also increase our longevity through epigenetics. So now I think there is a lot of material that has covered so far. And perhaps we can maybe take a pause here and do a short practice together just to kind of maybe reground ourselves and maybe even clear our mind a little bit before we move on to the next segment of this talk. So I would invite you to perhaps take your screen off, take your eyes off the screen, and lowering your gaze or close your eye if that feels more comfortable for you. Finding a comfortable position, perhaps feeling the feet supporting by the ground, your sitting bone touching the chair, supporting you. Your spine can be straight but not stiff. Relaxing your shoulders, softening your jaws, softening the muscles around the eyeballs and the temples. Take in a few nourishing breaths. As you breathe in, noticing the sensation in your body, perhaps through the nostril or the expansion of the chest and the abdomen. And as we breathe out, noticing the collapse of the abdomen, the chest wall, and the air passing through the nostril. There's no need to change your breath in any way. Simply let the breath breathe itself. From time to time, you may notice that our minds tend to drift here and there, either to the past or towards the future. And if that happens, that's okay. It's what the mind naturally does. In fact, when you're aware that your mind has wandered, it is exactly what mindfulness and meta awareness is all about. Every time you notice that your mind has wandered, at that moment, when you recognize that your mind has been lost, that's a moment of meta awareness. That's a moment of awakening. You can simply, gently, without any judgment, escort your mind back to the breath. As we come to the closing of this very short practice, I would like to invite you to ask yourself this question silently and answer yourself silently. Why are you here? Why are you here? Really, why are you here? Thank you. I would like to invite you back, and we will continue with kind of like the second segment of this talk. Now, I think some of you may be asking, when I was giving the first segment of the talk, I understand that it is important to build inner resources and that well-being is a trainable skill. However, they do not address the underlying problems in the healthcare system, which is a major source of our distress. Well, actually, this is exactly the same question that I have been asking myself. And this is why I think developing system thinking skills is equally important. So what is system thinking? It is an approach that has been widely applied in many fields, including biology, management, and deep ecology. According to system theory, a system is a set of elements or parts that is coherently organized and interconnected in a pattern or structure. For example, we have cells in our body which form organs, which together form individuals in biological system. Individuals then form social, economic, and political systems consisting of families, units, and teams, organizations, communities, and societies. And these systems, in turn, are parts of the earth and impact the ecological system. Now, a system has 6 key features. The first is interconnectedness. Rather than being isolated, things are actually interconnected, that everything is reliant upon something else. For example, think about the coffee you drank this morning. It comes from coffee beans, which require the sun to grow, farmers to plant coffee trees, and truck drivers to transport them, etc., etc. So you can see how interconnected we are for everything we need. To understand systems, we also need nonlinear thinking, understanding that things don't happen in linear fashion, but are part of complex web-like relationships with solutions that may look counterintuitive on first glance. System thinking also requires us to synthesize, to understand that the parts and the whole in order to see the bigger picture, to see that the sum is greater than its parts. System must also emerge and adapt. Here we are today with COVID. what has emerged. Zoom has emerged, and rounds have been adapted to this format. Another feature is that system communicates through positive and negative feedback loops. The weather and the four seasons are a good example of this. In the fall, when the days start to get shorter, the leaves change colors, and this is communicated through feedback loops. And finally, causality, how changing one element results in changes in other elements in a dynamic fashion. Now, there are many system thinking tools, and because of time limitation, I won't be able to go through each of them, but I would like to highlight the iceberg model, which I found to be particularly useful. Now, in this model, an event is only the tip of an iceberg. That's why it's called the iceberg model. The event is usually very compelling because it requires us to respond immediately. For example, if a house is on fire, we'll react by trying to put out the fire right away. Now, although this is an appropriate action, it is not adequate from a system perspective. Why? Because our primary mode of action is reactive. It does not address or change the fundamental problems or structures that cause the event to begin with. In the next level below, we start to notice a pattern over a period of time, and we may adapt within the constraint of the current system, for example, by taking shortcuts or finding workarounds. In a burning house model, burning house example, we may even arrange to have more water buckets around. However, we are not trying to change the pattern. Instead, we're simply adapting to it. Although we can be intentional about making adaptations, the pitfall is that we could be unaware of what we are doing, allowing the pressure to build, and we struggle more and more to cope. And unfortunately, most people and organizations find themselves stuck in being reactive or adaptive, which are fast and easy and provide small leverage in the short term. However, to have greater leverage, to have higher impact, and to make more lasting improvements, we need to learn to operate at deeper levels. In the next level, where there is more leverage, we look at the systemic structures, such as rules, power dynamics, and information flow that produce the patterns and events. And then we can create new systemic structures, either through redesigning existing ones or making new ones. And we can change the events and patterns this way. And this process is creative because we're changing the system rather than just adapting or reacting to it. But how do we change the structures? What principles should it be based on? This is where the next level of mental models comes in. Changing systemic structures often requires to change our assumptions or mental images of what things ought to be, to think outside the box. At the level of mental models, the action we take is reflective because it requires us to develop the ability to question our own assumptions about how things work. However, changing our mental models is often a very difficult and painful process because they're so firmly embedded in us through years of experience. So the question is, why would we choose to change our mental models given that it is so difficult to change? The answer, I think, has to be that we have a compelling vision of a new and a different world that we are committed to create. With vision, our actions are generative, bringing something completely new into being that did not exist before. Now, one thing we should note is that the deeper the layers of the iceberg, the more leverage we get from our actions. However, the action in the deeper layers are actually harder and take longer time to implement. And that may explain why people usually stay at the surface layers because they're easier and quicker. Now, again, while there is nothing inherently wrong about it, we need to expand our thinking and realize that if we truly want to improve the system, we need to dig deeper and remember that the most impactful actions are those that are based on a transformative vision. I think the iceberg model can be used to address many kinds of problems. It is a very practical tool that I've used to help me in many, when I was in different leadership positions. And for the purpose of this talk, We can also use this model to look at the distress in healthcare. As you probably know, I think all of you know, in survey after survey in many countries, an alarming proportion of healthcare workers, anywhere from 30 to 50%, have been found to experience burnout, which is a depleted state characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and no personal accomplishment. And this has been kind of like made worse because of the pandemic. Now, many people may focus or blame the individuals when they hear about burnout. After all, many studies have pointed to the patterns or individual traits that are common in people who experience distress. For example, while perfectionism is desirable in our culture, and especially in healthcare, it can also become maladaptive when we set such a high bar that it is not achievable. Or take altruism as an example. It is expected of healthcare workers, and especially during the pandemic, altruism is what we expect of healthcare workers. But sometimes it is hard to draw the line between healthy and pathologic altruism. We may also experience empathic distress when we encounter other suffering and not be able to regulate our own emotions. These are also exacerbated by other traits such as self-recrimination, self-doubt, and self-neglect that are very common in the healthcare workplace. If we go deeper, we will find that there are also many systemic structures that contribute to our distress. For example, bullying is quite common, with 40% of healthcare professionals reported experiencing it in the workplace. We may experience moral sufferings when we know what is the right thing to do, but cannot do it because of internal or external constraints. Or we may experience burnout because of a sense of lack of control from poor workflow and cumbersome paperwork. And there are also systemic discrimination, whether it is based on gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation. For trainees, residents, medical students, fellows, there's also the hidden curriculum. Now, what is the hidden curriculum? Unlike the official curriculum that formally stipulates the set of knowledge and skills required, the hidden curriculum is the unofficial and implicit values and rules that governs our trainees' behaviors. For example, don't challenge your staff, or don't complain because your generations have it easy already. I think when I really look at this situation, I think the reality is that we are actually all very well aware of these issues. We have experienced or witnessed this happening, and they're actually not new to us. So the question is, why do they persist? Why do these problems persist in the healthcare system? And that's where we need to go even deeper to look at our mental models. And one of them is the status quo bias. I've heard many frontline workers who said that, well, we have tried many things before, but nothing seemed to work and nothing stuck. Because they have seen many managers and directors come and go. And when these new leaders come on board, they have all kinds of ideas. Oh, let's try this for a few months. And then it didn't work. Let's try that for another few months. It is as if each initiative is simply a fad. It is no wonder that people could become jaded or even become cynical because nothing seems to stick. This is compounded by the power hierarchy, which is particularly prominent in any large organization. People lower in the hierarchy are often reluctant to share their ideas or speak up, either because they feel that the suggestions often fall on deaf ears, or because they're afraid of being reprimanded, or they simply do not have time to reflect because they're already so busy. Another mental model that is deeply ingrained in healthcare, especially in recent decades, I think, is the intense focus on economic rationality to contain costs, to maximize productivity, and to enhance efficiency. It is perhaps not surprising that we experience distress because this is not what draws us to healthcare in the first place. This is not what we are trained to do. And this deprives us of the deeply humane and interpersonal relationships with our patients. The big question is, having experienced these issues ourselves, do we want to do something about it? What is our highest vision? What concrete steps can we take to improve the system? To improve the system can sometimes feel like a daunting task. We may not know where to start, and we may sometimes even feel paralyzed because it's so big. And you might say, well, Agnes, your analysis is very interesting, but when we have to deal with difficult people, it is hard to stay calm or think clearly. When dealing with conflicts or power hierarchy, it is hard to speak up or speak truth to power. And I think this is where the rubber meets the road. We need to know that what we can do immediately, that no one can stop us, is to build our own inner resources first. We need to work on ourselves first so that we can respond more skillfully. And then from this strong foundation, we can choose to work on whatever issue that is closest to our heart so that we can begin to improve the system. For example, often when a challenging event happens, we have a tendency to blame. We may blame the people or the situation. And this often comes from a place of reactivity. And building inner resources allow us to develop the ability to resist the pull of blame, to develop attention stability, to still focus on the event, so that between the event and our response, we can create a space. And then from this space, we can choose how to respond skillfully rather than react. If we dig a little bit deeper, we may also discover that underneath the surface, there are often unhealthy or unhelpful patterns, such as our negative self-narrative or the drama triangle of victim, rescuer, and perpetrator. Building inner resources allow us to be more emotionally stable so that we won't easily get drawn into the drama, so that we can refrain from saying or doing something that could be hurtful or harmful in the heat of the moment and then regret it later. If we go even deeper, we may begin to notice the many unspoken rules and the hidden dynamics. And we may begin to see the systemic structures in the healthcare system with more clarity, to see more clearly when we are in situations that requires us to speak up, whether it be bullying, moral distress, or discrimination. And I see more clearly how our mental models work, how our habitual thought patterns and assumptions bias our own views, we can begin to develop better relationships to our thoughts and move towards greater insights. And with more balance, more stability, and insight, they set the stage for the cultivation of compassion. And since we're all part of this intricately interconnected system, how could we bring forth our kind and compassionate heart to transform the system that we're embedded in? Could we start by not only taking care of patients, but also one another in our workplace, in our environment, as there's so much burnout, moral distress, and injustice in our workplace. And indeed, if we expand our purpose to really look at what matters most in life, perhaps we may realize that what we all want and long for is a world in which everyone lives a purposeful, fulfilling, and flourishing life. So I cannot emphasize enough that building inner resources is like physical exercise. We can read all about it, learn how the physiology works, look up what kind of exercise is best. But without actually doing the work, without the physical repetitions, we will not build the muscles that we want. Building inner resources is the same. We have to set our intention to practice and to train ourselves. And not only that, just as we don't wait till we are sick to exercise and it will be too late, we need to start now before challenges or catastrophes hit us so that we can weather whatever storm that comes our way. So I strongly encourage you to check out, the mindfulness projects offer many courses and also many apps and books that are available, and start practicing. And if you want to kind of read more about this topic, I will highly recommend the book called Mindfulness, which is an 8-week program by Professor Mark Williams. This book actually was my introduction to mindfulness like about 8 years ago. Another very good book that I highly recommend is written by Dr. Ron Epstein, who was one of our guest speakers. I think was in October or November. This is a great book that describes the importance of the ability to attend in the healthcare environment. And lastly, if you want to kind of go deeper, I actually recently published a book by Oxford University Press, which actually covered what I've talked about today. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And Energy also mentioned earlier that there is a life training available, which is a 10 months course, Mindfulness Compassion Training by Surrender Institute. You can also check out more information from this website. So I think I will stop here. We're 1 minute over. I will stop sharing the screen and then so that I can see everybody. And if there's any questions,